Hey guys, welcome to the next video for chapter 18. And for this one, we're going to do a very quick combo video for sections 2 and 3. So in this one, we're going to be getting into how the revolution unfolds after the initial phase of the storming of the Bastille. And the first thing we're going to be discussing here is the reforms brought on by the National Assembly. So the National Assembly decides to take action by implementing a number of reforms. Now remember, the National Assembly was the group formed by the Third Estate when it broke away from the Estates General. Eventually, members of the First and Second Estate realized that they did have to join as well. And one of the first things that they did was issue this document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man, technically the rights of man and citizen. And as you can tell by the title, this document was modeled after the Declaration of Independence. And like it, the Declaration of the Rights of Man was based on Enlightenment principles, saying that all men are born with natural rights like life, liberty, property, and security, and that all men are equal before the law. Its principles were in the revolutionary slogan of liberty, equality, and fraternity, or as you can see here, liberté, égalité, fraternité, which you have to say in a very haughty accent if you're doing it like the French. So moving along here. Another reform was the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in 1790. This essentially put the church under government control. All priests and bishops were now employees of the French government, and all church land now belonged to France. It also ended the authority of the Pope over French Catholics. This was widely rejected by rural peasants who were more religiously conservative. It created problems between the revolutionaries in Paris and the peasants in the countryside. Another big change was the Constitution of 1791. Let me get me out of the way again here. This created what we call a limited monarchy. Now, most of the power went to the legislative branch. So you see this cartoon here kind of metaphorically showing like the king is in a cage. It wasn't literal at that sense, but they were looking to constrain the power of the king. It gave more it gave more power to the legislative assembly so that they could do things such as levy taxes, declare war, and make laws. Now, for many, the Constitution completed the revolution, but for many others, it didn't go far enough, eventually leading to a call for more radical changes. We'll get to that in a bit, but first I want to discuss quickly the role of women in the revolution. Now, women were disappointed that the Declaration only pertained to men. Aside from the wording of its title, the Declaration gave no new rights or status to women. One woman in particular, this woman Olympe de Gouges, took it upon herself to implement changes, and she wrote the Declaration of the Rights of Women and Female Citizens as a response to this Declaration of the Rights of Man. Now, this was met with some support at first, but de Gouges and other more outspoken women were dealt with harshly during later stages of the revolution. Women did lead an important event during this time with the March on Versailles. You see a picture of Olympe with that Declaration of Women. Many in Paris were starving, and in October 1789, about 6,000 women marched the 13 miles from Paris to Versailles. And they went to the king's palace and they chanted bread as they arrived. Now, once they got there, the king comes out and he realizes that he better go with them. And so they demanded that he return to Paris. He realized they had no choice. So not only the king, but his family, they go with the crowd. Now, they didn't know it at the time, but the royal family would never again return to Versailles. So now let's get into a phase of the revolution known as the radical phase. Now, as we just said, for a lot of people, the Civil Constitution of the Clergy and the Constitution of 1791, they weren't enough. People wanted more change, and a number of events allowed these more radical groups to come to power. A major problem France faced at this point was conflict with other nations. These conflicts began because Europe turned on France. This is what it looked like at the time. You have the Bourbon family of Louis XVI, and then you've got the Habsburg family, and they were the family of Marie Antoinette, who was Louis's wife. So you've got his in-laws that are now getting really concerned about what's going on in France. They didn't want the ideas of the revolution spreading into their lands. These fears were stoked by nobles and priests who fled France and when they started to lose their status. They began to spread these horror stories about what was happening back in France. European rulers began closing borders and speaking out against the new French government. Many in France feared that war would soon be upon them. Now, due to the unease and fear, many lost faith in the new French government, leading to a group known as the Jacobins taking power. Now, the Jacobins were a revolutionary group of the bourgeoisie. Remember, they were the middle class. They pushed a more radical agenda calling for change. They also eventually gained support in the government, eventually winning control of it in 1792. So France was now controlled by the radicals, and they decided not to wait for the rest of Europe to attack, and they declared war on Austria, Prussia, and Great Britain. So France now had to deal with both internal and external conflict. This led to a lot of people in France to call for a republic. But the problem with that is that you can't have a monarchy and a republic because a republic is something of the people. So that meant the king had to go. And this brings us to the monarchy being abolished. Abolish means they end it, and it officially makes France a republic. This also means bad news for Louis, and they put Louis on trial in 1793, and he was found guilty, and he was beheaded, and his head was paraded around the crowd to cheers. A few months later, his wife Marie Antoinette was also executed. So the king's death ignited a period known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror lasted about 9 months, from September 1793 to July 1794. France was still at war with several other nations and was also dealing with rebellions against the new governments in the countryside. To deal with these threats, they formed this organization called the Committee of Public Safety. This was 12 men, and it was dominated by the Jacobins, and they had total control over France. So France really turned into a dictatorship at this point. They were in charge of preparing France for war, as well as trials and executions for anyone they thought was against a revolution. It was led by this individual known as Maximilien Robespierre. Now, Robespierre was the leader of the Jacobins. He believed that the only way to achieve a good republic was through terror. He said liberty cannot be secured unless criminals lose their heads. And the way they lost their heads was with the guillotine. The guillotine became the symbol of the Reign of Terror and one of the enduring images of the French Revolution. Robespierre and the committee held trials meant to weed out traitors. This led to mass imprisonment and executions. About 300,000 people were arrested during this time, and 17,000 were executed. That's a seating capacity for the Barclays Center when the Nets play. So an entire NBA stadium was executed. Eventually, the killing got too much for the people, and they turned on the Jacobins. And in July of 1794, Robespierre was arrested, and he himself went to the guillotine, ending the Reign of Terror. So the craziness really died down after this, although the revolution would enter one last final phase, which we'll discuss in the next video.